Hello, I'm Katie Steckles.
And I'm Peter Rowler. And Katie, what's today's mathematical object?
Today's mathematical object is a ball of wool.
Wow.
Which is, it turns out, as with many of our objects, much more mathematical than you might imagine. And I have brought along a special guest to come and tell us a bit more about that. So welcome, Pat.
Hello, Katie. Thank you. And hello, Peter.
Hello.
Excellent. So, Pat, first of all, if you want to tell us a bit about yourselves and why you're here to talk about a ball of wool.
Well, we've been quite well known as mathematical knitters, which sort of happened by accident, really, over the past 25 years or so. Our website's called Woolly Thoughts. It has all sorts of connotations. It's to do with wool. Woolly could mean that it's all a bit vague, and in some ways it is a bit vague, but it's also very, very mathematical in other ways. So it's all rather strange, and it's evolved to where it is now. But talking about a ball of wool in particular, two misnomers to begin with. People tend to say wool, but these days most of the things that you buy in a wool shop are not wool. They're some kind of other yarn, man-made, natural combination of the two. Very rarely just wool. So that's perhaps not quite right. And the other thing is, if you say ball, most people would say, if you ask them to describe a ball, they would say it was spherical. And you do not go into a wool shop and buy something that is a sphere.
So ball of wool is probably not the right term in any way. We're talking, I don't know, spheroid of yarn?
Well, exactly, yes. But everybody says a ball of wool, so we'll go with that, we'll stick with that. But once you get over that problem, there's all kinds of other problems come up. We deal a lot with people who say they can't do maths. They were no good at maths at school. They're frightened of maths. So we tend to go into things without really mentioning maths too much. Try to keep it a bit practical until they get a bit more involved. Now, this ball of wool that we're talking about very often is 100 grams. That still causes problems a bit with some of the Americans or other countries because they still tend to think in ounces. So that's another problem it hit. And if 100 grams, it's not really a very useful measurement because if it's very, very fine yarn, it can be 1,000 metres. If it's a very thick yarn, it might only be 50 metres. And you're obviously going to knit a lot less with 50 metres than you can knit with 1,000 metres. So a weight on a ball isn't that much use. You need to know what the length is before you know how much you're going to be able to knit with it.
Yeah, you almost want kind of a grams per metre or something on the yarn.
Yeah,
and this is one thing that's always amused me about yarn weights, is that the system is obviously evolved over lots of time and different people using yarn for different things, but there is a sort of ordering on the thicknesses of yarn that you can get. And as far as I understand it, it goes fingering, 4-ply, double knit, Aran, chunky, super chunky, mega chunky. And that's just the system that everyone uses.
That's in the UK though. Once you go to America, you get sport and worsted that drop in between and all kinds of other things. So it isn't really even quite that simple.
Yeah, but none of them are a number or even a grams per metre. They're just names and they all mean different things.
Yeah, there are some systems where they do say 4-ply, 5-ply, 6-ply, 7-ply, but even those aren't really standard. And as you go from one country to another, they're not standardised. So it all gets quite complicated, really. Yeah. The amount of wool that's in your ball is quite a big issue. And you were saying about grams per metre or whatever. Most of the time, I use double knitting wool, yarn, whatever. And I know that I can knit approximately 50 stitches from 1 metre. So all my calculations I base on 50 stitches to a metre. In actual fact, it's slightly more than 50, but 50 is a nice number to work with. So whenever I'm trying to calculate how much I need to make a particular pattern, that's what I work on, and it's a pretty good guide. But it's a very personal thing. It depends on how tightly you knit, what stitches you're doing. If it's lace with lots of holes in, then it spreads out a lot more. It doesn't work for everything, but for my basics, it's good enough.
Yeah, this was something that always fascinated me when I started knitting, because a lot of balls of wool come with, or even knitting patterns come with an instruction to knit a tension square, which is to measure the tension that you're knitting with. So depending on the thickness of your needles and the thickness of the wool, and as you say, how tight you actually kind of pull the thread as you're knitting. If you knit a 10 by 10 square of stitches, that could be any size depending on all of those factors. And you can kind of use that as a gauge to work out how many stitches to put into the garment or whatever. But I love that when I was starting out, I was like, right, I'm going to knit a thing. And it telling me before I even started, oh, you've got to knit a square of stitches. I'm like, that's more than I was planning to knit anyway. I was just going to knit a little thing.
Yes.
That's going to take me half an hour before I start my actual thing.
Yeah, and if it's wrong, just pull it under the start again. Yes, if it's small.
Exactly,
yeah. But it is, again, this is another thing that people find incredibly difficult once they start to think about the calculations, even if they don't really regard it as being maths. If the pattern says you need 5 stitches to the inch, and they've only got 4 stitches to the inch, or centimetres, whatever they're working in, they then have great difficulty trying to decide whether they need to use bigger needles to get a different number of stitches, or whether they need to use smaller needles. And it's really difficult to get people to try to use logic. It's not really maths, it's just logic. And that's a really, really difficult thing to try and get over. They'll go in the wrong direction. They'll go smaller when they should be going bigger. But then they'll go even smaller. And some people will take sort of 5 or 6 goes at it before they get anywhere near to where they're supposed to be. And it's much more difficult than you might imagine.
I suspect kind of experienced knitters will have a sort of intuitive feel for it, but it's all based on the mathematics of, this many stitches per inch, and if my needles are bigger, the stitches will be bigger, and this, that, and the other. Yeah.
And also you get the proportions. You might get the width right, and the height is wrong. And that is quite difficult because, again, that's to do with how tightly people knit. And very often it's best to get if you're knitting a jumper, to get the width right, because it's easy to adjust the length. You can just knit longer or shorter as you go. If it's not long enough, you knit a bit more. So it's much more sensible to go for getting the width right, really.
Yeah, so I guess, because, when I first started out knitting, certainly my main ambitions were to knit things like a scarf, because this is obviously a very good entry-level... I'm going to say rectangle. Rectangle is probably the thing I was going for first. You start knitting, you knit the same number of stitches, hopefully. That took me a little while. But the same number of stitches on every row, and you end up with something that's kind of a sensible square shape. But I guess you can use knitting to make other shapes as well. So I believe you do workshops about this.
Yes. In the past, the main workshops that we used to do were based on knitting very, very simple shapes. And I'll just describe a sort of typical workshop. This would be with a group of mostly ladies, not always, but mostly, and quite a lot of them with a fear of maths. Don't want to hear the word maths at all. So what we used to do is to knit triangles to begin with in garter stitch. A garter stitch basically comes out as a square stitch, which is really nice. And if you start with 1 stitch, you increase so that you've got 2 stitches, and then on the next row you add another stitch, so you've got 3, and the next row you add another stitch, so you've got 4, and so on. you end up with a triangle that is getting wider and wider. And because it's a square stitch, that triangle actually has a 90-degree angle at the corner. So by the time you knit it, you've got a triangle that's about half of a square, really. And so what we used to do was to get the ladies to start off knitting these triangles, but knitting to a particular, to a template, to a shape, rather than saying knit until you've got 16 stitches. Just knit to a particular shape. So a square just marked out, so everybody had the same size square. And then you tell them to start with 1 stitch on the needle and to increase in that stitch so that they've got 2 stitches. And then on the next row, they increase at the end of the row so that they've got 3 stitches. And on the next row, they increase at the end of the row so they've got 4 stitches, and so on. And you keep going until that triangle that you're forming fits to the centre of the square, the diagonal of the square. And they end up with a 90-degree angle at the corner, and they've got half of a square. And once they meet that diagonal on the square, they then start to decrease at the other side. So having gone up to, say, 20 stitches, they then go, they take 1 off on every row. So they go down to 19, 18, 17, until you've worked off all the stitches. And they've got a square. And everybody ends up with a square exactly the same size because they've all worked the same template. It doesn't matter how thick the wool was. It doesn't matter how tightly they knit. Doesn't matter what size needles they use, they all fit into that square. So you can have quite widely varying looking shapes, but they're all the same size. And we used to actually ask people to not bring, most workshops would ask people to bring a particular type of yarn, particular size of needles. We didn't do that. We would say, bring whatever yarn you want, bring whatever needles you want. If you want to deliberately use what you would consider to be the wrong size needles, then you can do that and it will still work. You'll still get that same square. So they've done all this. So if you were actually using this in a maths lesson, which we sometimes did in school with children, you could by now be starting to talk about triangular numbers, square numbers, and the shapes that you've got. With our ladies in the workshop, we wouldn't do that at this point. We haven't mentioned maths at all yet. But once they've got that square, and you want to add something else onto it, it's very easy to work out how many stitches you need to pick up along the edge of the square and for it to lie flat. Because using Pythagoras, if the diagonal of the square would be root 2. So you can go from there to working out how many stitches you need to pick up along the edge of the square. And we always used to say 1.4 divided by 1.4.
Yeah.
Now, that's near enough to root 2 as far as I'm concerned. And we used to do it with a massive big calculator and press the buttons and pretend that we'd done this magic with the calculator. And then they would pick up the right number of stitches. And then from there, decrease at the end of every row. So you've got a little triangle coming off the top. And once you get to that stage, absolutely, without fail, the first person to finish would say, I've made a house.
Yep.
Because they've got a square with a little pointy roof on the top.
Yep.
And so this might be at the Women's Institute or somewhere else where you've got quite a lot of kind of quite smart and refined ladies who would all of a sudden say, I've made a house, we've made a row of houses, and they would all put their houses on the floor. And we still haven't mentioned maths. And we can then add on, you can carry on, you could add onto the top of that little roof, you could add on 2 more little triangles and turn it back into a rectangle. But at any point, you could start fitting these shapes together because you've got some sides that match up. And eventually, after quite a long time, we would start to drop in a little bit of maths and say, well, actually, that was triangular numbers, and that was Pythagoras, and that was the square root of 2. And then you have these people saying, oh, but I can't do maths, it can't be, I can't do that. And this sort of realisation that what they actually do is maths, it's quite a revelation, really. And everything we did sort of was built on that kind of idea, starting with something really, really simple and then just throwing in a bit more information.
Yeah, I mean, a lot of the workshops that kind of work really well in terms of maths things to try and kind of engage people, I find sometimes it's really fascinating to work with audiences that aren't necessarily expecting a maths workshop or who wouldn't actively seek out a maths workshop. And you can do things like, paper folding workshops or art workshops where there is some mathematical content in there. But this is, I feel like this is possibly quite an extreme of this, because you'll find, people who do knitting who maybe don't even think of maths as being part of what they're doing, but then you're kind of showing them that that is part of what they're doing, which is really interesting. And there's so much to think about, these kind of tessellations of shapes and, how the edges all fit together. And, I guess they must sort of intuitively know these things, but they've kind of never thought of them as being inherently mathematical.
Yes, if you, to a lot of knitters, if you mentioned maths and knitting, they would start to talk about the calculations to make the size of the garment that they wanted and things like that, without thinking in any other directions. Yeah. I mean, yes, there is a huge amount of maths involved, even if you're just following a traditional pattern. But we try to get away from that into something entirely different.
Yeah, well, it's the other kind of maths, isn't it? I guess, like for a mathematician, we've got this awareness that like there is the kind of maths that is, I need to work out my taxes and all these kind of sort of functional calculations. But then there's this other side of it that's the more sort of, looking at patterns in things and looking at how things fit together. And that is the side that mathematicians find more interesting. And of course,
where you can just play.
And that's the thing about it. And I guess, if you say maths, a lot of people think of adding up numbers and doing calculations, but that's not really what maths is all about in a lot of ways.
Yeah.
So I guess simple shapes are great, triangles are fantastic, but then one of the things that always makes me completely like blown away by the concept of knitting is that you can take like a one-dimensional string, I guess, and create sort of two-dimensional shapes, but then also kind of 3D things, in terms of,
yes.
I mean, a lot of people will do this by just following a pattern, but there are probably principles that you need to know to kind of turn knitting into a garment.
Because you're not just sort of a shape-filling curve. You're not just sort of winding it around. It's got to also hold its shape, right?
Well, one thing in particular that we try to get away from is the traditional knitting pattern for a sweater has a back, which is a flat piece, and a front, which is a flat piece, and then the two sleeves, which are flat pieces, and you see them laid out flat on the page. But a body is not flat. A body is a cylinder, and an arm is a cylinder, and you don't actually need to have a seam down the side of your sweater. You can join it together wherever you like, at any angle, in any direction, it doesn't really matter. And it's really difficult to get people away from that concept of the flat pieces. They just don't need to be like that. If somebody's making something in fabric, it's slightly different because they're starting with the flat piece and they've got to use the materials that they've already got. But if you're knitting something, you can go anywhere you like. It's become much more common in the last few years to knit sweaters in the round. So you do the body part in the round. But you could go in any direction. You could go from side to side and up the front and down the back, and trying to get people to kind of recognise the final shape they're aiming for is quite a challenge.
Well, I guess a lot of people who do kind of clothing design and fashion probably know a lot about the way that 2D shapes interact with 3D shapes, and that's kind of like an underappreciated skill, I guess. I've definitely seen people saying, here are how these people use maths. This is, taking a flat, or taking a 3D shape and breaking it down into pieces and thinking about how you might make it by putting together these pieces. And I guess the thing about knitting is that that's sort of a very extreme version of that. You can't just take a piece of fabric and cut out the shapes you want. You have to actually construct the shapes as you're going along.
The good thing about knitting, though, is that you can cheat a bit because it stretches and you can,
yes.
you can make it bend where fabric wouldn't bend. It would just rip or...
Yeah, because like on a piece of fabric, you'd do something like a tuck or something to a dart to make something curve round a shape. Whereas if you're knitting, you can just decrease some stitches in the right places and it will kind of reduce the width of it at the end, so you end up with a curve or whatever. But yeah, it's getting your head around how all of that works. I guess designing knitting patterns, I can follow knitting patterns no problem, but designing my own patterns must be kind of the next step.
Yeah, yes, it's one of those things that just evolved. If you're thinking about what you're doing, and inevitably, if you're making something and you don't like it quite like it is, you make a minor adjustment to it, and the next time you do something, you think, well, I did this last time, I could do this and do something that's a bit more dramatic, and gradually you move on from there to doing something that's almost entirely your own thing, really.
Yeah, a lot of the nice thing about knitted garments is that they are completely custom. Often they're totally unique. No one else has got one like it, and that's a really nice thing about them.
Except people do want to copy exactly what they've seen. There are an awful lot of people who say, I don't want that pattern, I want that pattern because I want it blue.
Right. Nice, yeah.
You do get that.
Wow.
So people do just want to copy exactly what they've seen.
So, Pat, I've seen you at things like Maths Jam conference, where you've brought along a lot of interesting things that you've made. So, as well as there being maths within knitting as an activity, you've also deliberately knitted mathematical things. Could you tell us about that?
Yes. It happened by accident, really. Way back, about 25 years ago, we were asked by an American company to design what they referred to as an Afghan. And we didn't really know what they were talking about, but it turns out it's one of those throws that the Americans always have over the back of you. Any American program you watch has got something over the back of the sofa, that type of thing. And the very first one that we did was very much like the squares that we do in the workshops. But having done that first one, where you've got a big space, perhaps 6 feet long, we suddenly realised that this was a wonderful canvas for putting ideas onto, and we could use it for all kinds of things. And one of the earliest things that we did was a representation of Pythagoras' theorem, thing that a lot of mathematicians would refer to as Pythagoras' tree, where you start with the square and then the triangles come off the side and the squares come off the side of that, and it goes like that type of thing. And we were teaching, at the time we were teaching in a school where about 97% of our children, their first language was not English, and a lot of language problems. And the first thing that I made, I took into school, hung it up on the wall, and the amount of interest from the kids was just unbelievable. To have a big item that they could touch and talk about, you could put it on the floor, they could walk on it without doing any harm to it. It was really quite a revelation, the way that they reacted to these things, and particularly with children where language was a problem, because we found that those who could understand what we were saying could easily point and explain to others in their own language, and the ideas were passed on. If you've got children sitting at desks with a piece of paper in front of them, or you've just got something that's on a blackboard or something like that, it's not the same. You haven't got that tactile experience that goes with it. You haven't got the facility to handle it and talk about it. And it just went from there, and we've now got about 100 different things of that kind of size that all represent mathematical ideas in one way or another. 4 of them are in the Science Museum in London. 1 of them has been on display once. I think the rest are still in their storeroom, but all kinds of different things. They're all on our website, so it's easy to go and look at the pictures.
Yeah, I think we've seen a couple of them in bits of posts for the aperiodical as well. I think in the math off we've seen some of these. And there's like the one with kind of different colours for prime factors of numbers and things like that. And there's so many different ways you can visualise kind of ideas using colours and shapes. So, but they just look really intricate, and like the amount of time that must have gone into each one is incredible.
They take a long time, but on the whole they are very, very simple. Most of them are still the really simple ideas, the same thing we use in the basic workshop. Just the shapes are just changed slightly. An awful lot of things just relying on 45-degree angles and 90-degree angles. And for a long, long time, that was all we did. We didn't use any other angles at all because it's more complicated to do other angles. We stuck with those for years and years and years. And of course, we're talking specifically about knitting, but we have got quite a few crochet things as well. I'm not as good at crochet as I am at knitting, but we've got quite a lot. Because there are some things that you just can't do in knitting for various reasons that do work well in crochet.
It sounds familiar that like there are rules of maths, and there are certain things that you can't do in maths that are kind of well known. You can't do things with ruler and compass construction, but you can do them with paper folding. So there's a lot of nice parallels there. Yeah, start with simple ingredients and build up and see where you can go, which is very much the spirit of play that you have in maths as well, isn't it? I guess simple rules. Yeah.
Yes, and we can go quite a long time without thinking of it. We've done so many things in the past, go a long time without thinking of any new ideas. And then all of a sudden, a picture will pop up from somewhere and you'll just think, oh, yes, I could use that idea. I can make that. It doesn't happen so often these days because we've done so many already, and there is a limit to what you can knit, really. And we have a house full of these things.
I can imagine, yeah.
Some of them will have to go eventually.
So you mentioned a website where people can see these things, and also if people fancy having a go and want to knit something of their own, could you tell us something about where people can find you online?
Well, our website is woollythoughts.com. Make sure you spell it correctly because it's got 2 L's in it. Americans tend to get it wrong because they only put 1 L in there. So woollythoughts.com is our website, which is a very, very sprawling website. Once you get there, you might disappear forever. And to buy the patterns, the best place to go really is Ravelry, which is a massive website for knitters and crocheters. And there is a Woolly Thoughts group on there, which has about 25,000 people in it. So there are about 25,000 people who have joined us, mostly because we say we do maths and scientific things and things like that. So that's the best 2 places to find us. We are in other places, but that's the best 2, really. Mm-hmm.
Yeah, it's really nice to know that you talk about it as though it's sort of you and Steve do a little bit of maths in your knitting, but actually there's this huge community of people who are happy to engage with that sort of thing. So that's lovely. So
if you want to get in touch with any of us, Pat is also on Twitter at Mathenitician. If you search for that or Pat Ashforth, you'll find her. And I'm also on Twitter at Stex.
And I'm at Peter Ola, and the podcast itself is at Maths Objects.
And both Peter and I blog at theaperiodical.com with, as I've mentioned, guest posts from Pat occasionally, and that's also where you can find more episodes of this podcast. And if you've enjoyed this episode and you've knitted anything yourself, or you'd like to share any suggestions for things that we might do podcasts about in the future, please drop us an email, objects@aperiodical.com.
The music is Funk Game Loop by Kevin MacLeod, licensed under Creative Commons.